takeaway of today's session. Extensive reading and listening is good for you, teachers. It's also good for your students. Extensive reading is probably the best way to help our students to acquire, to extend, and to also maintain their language proficiency over time. Essentially, there are two things that I want to share with you. Number one is the what and why of extensive reading and listening, the theory and the research that supports it. And point number two, I want to share with you some potential applications of extensive reading and listening in our teaching, in your teaching. And after that, discussions, questions, and answers from you, which Rob and I will be addressing at the very end of today's presentation or today's session. Let's begin the first one, the theory and the research, the what and the why of extensive reading and listening. Let's begin with the what first. What is extensive reading and listening? I'm going to describe extensive reading and listening in a way that is different from what we normally understand when we teach reading and listening in the classroom. Yeah? Here's the first point. Extensive reading and listening is reading and listening for pleasure, reading and listening for recreation. This is often not the kind of things that we do in our typical listening lessons or reading lessons. So the key word to remember is something that is pleasurable, something that is recreational is good for your students. And number two, when the students do read and listen, they're doing it for, just to get the general ideas about what the text is about. Very big, very broad ideas. If they want to, they can try to remember some of the details, but they don't have to. So this is not very much like what normally happens in the classroom, where the students, after they listen to a very short text, after they read a short text, they need to spend a lot of time trying to understand, to read, to find out every single details in the text that they're listening to or they're reading. And finally, another important point, pleasure reading, recreational reading and listening, extensive reading and listening is not for study purposes. But surprisingly, students who read a great deal, students who listen a great deal will never be advantaged when it comes to examinations, when it comes to us assessing their English language proficiency. So there's an important positive side effect of doing a lot of recreational reading and also pleasure reading and listening. A few more things about extensive reading and listening in terms of the text, in terms of the content of the text, of the listening text and the reading text. Point number one, very important to remember, the text materials, the reading materials, the listening materials will have to be very interesting, will have to be compelling. The kind of things that you want to, that happens when you read the first line or the second line or the first paragraph of a reading passage and you want to continue until you get to the end. So that is the kind of things that I have in mind when I say compelling, interesting, very, very exciting stuff. Number two, content is important, but the second consideration is that the language, the text, the grammar, the vocabulary will have to be accessible. It has to be at the student's level. Slightly above the student's level is okay, slightly, but not too much. A little below the student's level is also okay, especially when you work with students who have very little experience in listening, in understanding the language. That is perfectly okay. And number three, another important point. Unlike the typical reading and listening lessons that we do in the classroom, extensive reading and listening is very, very student-centered. We want to empower the students to make choices. We want to give them the flexibility and the freedom to choose what they want to read and listen. And if that happens, we can expect our students to read more and to listen more. And eventually, we'll be able to see our students reading and listening in massive quantity. The research is very clear when the students do a great deal of listening and reading. I think chances are very high that they will be able to develop a higher level of proficiency in the language. Let me just continue a little bit. This is one quote that I've seen in the professional literature. I can't remember the name of the book. What the researchers say is this, that language input through listening and reading is the sine qua non of language learning. Sine qua non means it's a prerequisite, it's a precondition. Without sufficient input, I don't think the students will be able to improve on their language proficiency. And this input usually comes in the form of reading and listening. In other words, we can acquire language from reading and we can also acquire language from listening. And if we do both listening and reading on a regular basis, I think chances are higher that we'll be able to develop, a higher proficiency, overall proficiency in the language. Let me take it one step further and look at what exactly students get from doing a lot of reading and listening. There are three major benefits. The first one, obviously, is a linguistic benefit, language learning benefits that you get from doing a lot of reading and listening. As you can guess, doing a lot of reading and listening will help students improve their word knowledge, their vocabulary knowledge. Again, research is very clear that word knowledge is one of the most important predictors of one's ability to speak, to write, and to understand the language. Without sufficient vocabulary, it's very difficult for you to read, understand, and use language for communicative purposes. Your grammar also tends to increase as well. Now, this is a special kind of grammar that your students will be able to develop over time. This is known as implicit grammar. I have a lot more to say about the implicit grammar of the language a bit later on. Another important benefit is this cognitive benefits. Students' knowledge of the world is likely to increase a great deal after they have spent 1 year, for example, reading a variety of texts, on a variety of topics. Their knowledge about places, their knowledge about history, their knowledge about travels, their knowledge about many other things. And again, we know from research that knowledge is important for comprehension purposes. It is not possible for you to understand a piece of text written in a specific context unless you know the context, unless you know the topic very well. Yeah. And these two combinations, word and world knowledge, will help our students in thinking about their reading and listening, and also in responding to important comprehension questions that teachers usually ask. And finally, remember, extensive reading and listening is about having pleasure, having a lot of enjoyment, having a lot of fun. So not surprisingly, the last benefit has to do with the feeling, the motivation, the will, the determination, and the excitement of learning. So we can expect all these three major benefits. If you do a good job providing students with the right kind of materials, and if you are doing a good job motivating your students in doing this, I think chances are very high that the students will be able to, to enjoy all these wonderful benefits that are very important in language learning. In other words, after a period of time, we can expect our students to develop their fluency in comprehension. And this fluency very easily will lead to improvement in students' ability to comprehend, to understand information that is presented in speaking and also in writing. Maybe, all these benefits are from the professional literature, from people like Rob and me, and from other experts in applied linguistics or in English language teaching areas. But if you ask people, people who have had real experience in writing and reading, like this person, a novelist who has written a lot of best-selling novels, this is what she says about the benefits of reading. And I'm going to read to you this very, very nice quote. Read 1,000 books. Is she exaggerating when she says read 1,000 books? I don't think so. 1,000 books is almost nothing if you are willing to spend the time doing it, not in one day, but maybe over a period of time. Read 1,000 books and your words will flow like a river. Now, this person does not use the word fluency or any other fancy words associated with language learning, but this person uses a very easy word like flow. And flow means fluency. Yeah? Your ability to use language effortlessly, and that is what flow is all about. Extremely important concept in language learning. Ladies and gentlemen, in addition to increased fluency and comprehension, are there any other bonuses? Yes. Now here is the bonus. Again, this is something that I've experienced myself and I've seen from the professional literature and also from my conversations with a lot of teachers, in the region and in some other places. Students who have become fluent readers after doing a lot of reading and listening are more likely to develop a higher writing skills. In the same way, students who have done a lot of listening are very, very likely to become better, more sophisticated speakers as well. It is from listening, it is from doing regular listening that you develop the ability to pronounce words clearly and accurately and with flair, if you like. Yeah, so there's a lot of benefits associated with extensive reading and extensive listening. At this point, let me share with you a quote from one of the big guys here in language education, Stephen Krashen. Yeah. Clearly, he mentions the connection between reading and writing. Now, this is what he says. When enough reading is done, let me say that one more time. When enough reading is done, enough reading doesn't mean reading one whole week. That's not enough, yeah? That means reading a lot of materials over a period of time. When enough reading is done, all the necessary grammatical structures and discourse rules for writing will automatically be presented to the writer in sufficient quantity. I think this is something that we all need to remember. If you want to help your students to write better, to write well, I think the very first step you need to do is to provide students with enough reading. What about the connection between speaking and listening? I'm going to follow exactly what Krashen says, and I will exactly copy what he said and turn what he said into something like this. When enough listening is done, I think the same thing is likely to happen because the listeners will have heard a lot of grammatical structures, discourse rules, and other language rules. And gradually, eventually, they'll be able to make use of these rules, these conventions, when they try to express themselves orally in speaking. Getting a bit more complicated now, but not very complicated. Now, this is a very, very simple representation or simple model of how language learning happens, from input to all the way to output, from listening and reading all the way to students being able to produce the language for speaking and writing. Let's begin with the last one here. Our job, one of our most important jobs is to help our students to become more capable in expressing themselves orally and in writing. We want them to become good users of the language. In order for that to happen, I think from our discussion today, we know that input is a sine qua non of language acquisition. So whether you like it or not, they have to do this. They have to do sufficient, enough, or Rob will use the word massive. They have to do massive listening and reading over a period of time. But not any kind of reading, not all reading or listening will be useful. Now, this is the kind of reading and listening that is easy, that is pleasurable, that is enjoyable, and that is available on a regular basis, frequency, daily, weekly basis, and also in large quantity. If that happens, I think, I'm very sure that students will acquire the linguistic system of the new language that they are learning. Now, the big question for us is this: what does it look like when you say that they have acquired the linguistic system? What does it look like? Does it look like this? The system that you have in your head that allows you to produce language spontaneously, effortlessly, fluently, accurately, and things like that. Does it comprise hundreds and hundreds of grammar and discourse rules? Yusafa, please answer. Please say no.
No, Pak Willy.
Very good. That's a very good answer. Yes, no. The answer is yes. There may be a few grammar rules or discourse rules that you learn explicitly, from your teachers. But the majority of these grammar and discourse rules are not explicit. They are very, very implicit. Now, here is another quote for you that I want to share with you. It's a very important quote from two second language acquisition researchers. Yeah, just pay attention to the bolded text. The system that we have in our head as a result of doing a lot of listening and reading over a period of time, number one, is very complex. Can you describe this complex system? Yes, a little bit. Very, very little. What about the grammar books that provide you with like hundreds and hundreds of grammar rules? That is just barely the scratching the surface of this complex grammatical system that we have in our head that enables us to use the language for real communication. Point number two is that this system is implicit, largely implicit, largely intuitive. When you are able to say that, hey, this sentence doesn't sound right, you are making use of that implicit language. Of course, occasionally as a language teacher, you are able to put your fingers on okay, there's a subject-verb agreement problem, there's a noun clause problem, probably you can say that, yeah? But for real purposes of language learning and language using, I don't think there is a need for the students to acquire a lot of explicit linguistic knowledge or grammar knowledge of the language. And what are the sources of this complex, abstract, and implicit system? Is the language input. So that's why I mentioned early on that this input is a sine qua non of language learning, of language acquisition. Now here is another quote. This one is easier to understand, yeah? And hopefully you will remember this. I have memorized this line, so every time I am giving a presentation, I will cite this quote. It's a very nice quote. And nobody disagrees, actually. Nobody who have had a lot of experience teaching and are familiar with the professional literature will agree with this statement. I mean, read this very carefully. The ability to produce language, to speak, and to write. That is to produce language relatively easily. That means fluently, accurately, and also effortlessly for communicative purposes, not for exam purposes. Remember this, not for exam purposes. Draws heavily on implicit knowledge, not on explicit knowledge. I'm not saying explicit knowledge is not important. It is, but the role it plays in language learning is not as much as we believe, it does. Let me share with you a case study, a very, very interesting case study that was done some years back. Now, the case study examines what some of the most successful English language learners in China did before they became very good users of the language. So we are looking at those kids, high school students, who are very good, who are winners of national English language competition. So these people are really, really very good, because in China we are talking about millions of people out there. So if you win, at the national level, then you must have been able to compete with, thousands and thousands of other competitors. And when they were interviewed, they said this very clearly: I spent many hours doing what? Doing grammar exercises. Yusafa, please say no. Doing grammar exercises? No. Doing a lot of grammar drills? No. Listening to teachers' explanation of the grammar rules? Please say no. They do, but they're not really understanding the explanation of their teachers. This is what they did. They listen again and again and again. So listening again, reading again is what extensive reading and extensive listening is all about. Now here are some quotes from the students who were interviewed by the researcher. This is what they say. I think you will also have experienced this, at the early, phase of your language learning experience. I was slow in the beginning and I had to listen to it many more times. Surprise, surprise, no surprise. That's what usually happens. And I gradually developed some feel for the language. Remember the word feel here? Intuition, implicit knowledge. That is what it is all about. Yeah. Of course, this student doesn't know the word implicit.